haven't handed it in yet, try and get that done for the end of today. Today, I'm basically going to be giving you an introduction of how we can conceptualize British rule in India. So we'll be exploring 4 concepts which make it easier for us to understand the 100-year period from 1857 to 1947 in the making of modern India. And then we'll be going into a chronological overview of the making of modern India in 3 different parts. So today I'll be focusing on the making of modern India from 1857, the Indian Mutiny, all the way until 1900, okay? So the first thing I need you to do is think about how we can develop our understanding of British rule in India. And the way that we're going to do this is by exploring 4 key concepts which will contextualize British rule in India. And they are imperialism, nationalism, democratization, and communalism. Okay, and the task that you will need to complete is, by listening to the video and reading the extract that I provide you with, okay, explore the meaning of each of these 4 concepts by using the framework on this slide. So by using this framework, what I would like you to do is define and explore the meaning of each of the concepts, okay, and unpick them and provide examples sort of for them. Right. So imperialism. So imperialism sort of relates to extending a country's power and influence through the direct acquisition or annexation, which means taking over of territories and colonies, okay? And obviously with that direct acquisition of territories and colonies, the mother country, the country who invades the other countries, it gains political and economic control of those regions, okay? So we've got the examples of the British Empire, we've got the French Empire, we've also got the German colonial empire during the chancellorship of Otto von Bismarck in the late 19th century. So that was particularly prominent from the 1870s onwards, and you also might have studied or heard of the Scramble for Africa. In India, though, we're sort of concerned with 2 types of imperialism. Okay, the first is economic imperialism, okay, and that is the British desire to expand their economic interest in South Asia and seek gains for the benefit of their own country, okay. So their purpose in invading India is to seek economic benefits, to economically exploit India for their own benefit. So authors like John Wilson, who wrote the book India Conquered, and Shashi Tharoor, who wrote Inglorious Empire, they argued that the industrialization of Britain throughout the 19th century, it was based on the deindustrialization of India. So in other words, Britain economically exploited India for their own benefit, okay? We're also concerned with something we call cultural imperialism, and that is the British desire to, in quotation marks, civilize the natives, okay, to modernize and westernize customs and traditions in Indian society, which in quotation marks were perceived by the British, as being backwards, okay? So that, an example of that is the banning of the Sati tradition in 1829, and that was a tradition whereby if a woman's husband had passed away, they would sit on top of the funeral pyre, and they would be burnt alive with the husband who had already passed away. Okay, so the British banned that that sort of practice, and they also allowed those widows then to remarry. Moving on, nationalism has a 2-fold definition, okay, and this is really, really important. So firstly, it relates to, quite simply, loyalty and devotion to a nation, okay? So it can be the identification with your own nation and support for its interests, which are placed above the interests of other nations. And one of the important things about learning sort of history is not only to place events within their historical context, but to try and also relate ideologies and key concepts such as nationalism to how they operate in society today. And I was thinking about this in quite a lot of detail. And what I sort of thought of was the nationalism that Trump is embodying at the moment. So what we term as, and some of our politicians will learn this throughout the year, what we term as Trumpian nationalism. Okay, so what we see in America is when Trump was elected, firstly as president in 2016, during his campaign trail, during his presidential campaign trail, he was elected on this sort of premise, this rhetoric of America first. Okay. Um, so that was taking a non-interventionist approach to foreign policy so that US domestic policy can be prioritized. So that is essentially ensuring that the USA are not interfering as much in the affairs of other nations, and not interfering as much in the international sphere to prioritize their own sort of domestic policy. So focusing on their own sort of defense, perhaps, their own sort of education system, health system, etc., etc. So one of the ways in which Trump has sought to do this is ensuring that there's spending cuts abroad. So reducing the amount of money, American money, that is spent, okay, helping other nations out abroad, and also from withdrawing troops from where they're stationed abroad, okay. Secondly, it also refers to the desire of achieving political independence through self-determination, and this right to self-determination, it was primarily advocated by Woodrow Wilson in the early 20th century, after the First World War, in the years of 1918 approximately, where the Paris Peace Conference took place before the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. And what Woodrow Wilson advocates in his sort of in his 14 points is that countries should have the right to self-determination. They should have the right to govern themselves and govern their own affairs. That essentially sort of provided a message to the colonies that they should challenge the people who have colonized them, okay, and they should seek to determine and govern their own affairs, okay, or be in sort of negotiation with their colonizers about how they could become self-ruling, independent countries, okay. So in India, primarily, we're concerned with what we term as anti-colonial nationalism. Okay, so that is the desire of the Indian nationalists to have full control over the governance of their own affairs. Okay, so for example, as we'll learn, we see the mobilization of the masses in India, so the masses of people in India, by the Indian National Congress, for example, and Gandhi. Okay, and these masses, these peasants across the country in different regions, they're mobilized and they're galvanized to participate in the anti-colonial movement, in the various sort of programs and the non-cooperation movements that are set up by Gandhi and the Indian National Congress primarily. Now, moving on to democratization. So democratization is a transition to a more democratic system of government. Okay, so it's providing Indians with the ability to participate in the governance of their own affairs through the provision of constitutional reforms. And what we'll look at is the Indian Council Acts, which were passed throughout that 100-year period. Now, this is really important, because the constitutional reforms implemented by the British colonial administration, okay, they sought to progressively provide Indians with more self-government. Okay, so the purpose of these democratic reforms was to allow the Indians to progressively, over the course of the 100-year period, become more in control of their own affairs. Now, this started on a local level, and soon it then spread to a sort of a country-wide level, whereby there were plans to create a central government, or a sort of federal structure in India. Lastly, we've got communalism. So communalism is antagonism, okay, it is conflict between groups which are organized around affiliations to a particular religion. So Hindu, Muslim, or Sikh, for example, in India. It is also a conflict, though, between different castes. So it's not necessarily conflict between different religious communities in India. So it's not just so conflict between the Hindu community, the Muslim community, the Sikh community, but it's also conflict between different castes. Okay, so for example, the Brahmin caste in Hinduism against the untouchables, the Dalit caste in India. There's quite a lot of conflict there. There's also the construction of communalism, okay, as authors like Pandey argue, of as a result of democratic constitutional reforms introduced by the British. So authors like Pandey, they argue that how can I explain this? They argue that communalism is a colonial construction primarily because of the constitutional democratic reforms they instituted. Okay, so for example, these reforms that the British instituted, the reforms that they introduced, it prompted the different religious communities to mobilize according to their religious affiliations. Okay, and we'll learn a little bit more about that later on. But quite simply, okay, communalism can be defined as three things. Okay, antagonism between different religious groups, conflict between those different religious groups, conflict between different castes of people, and then we've got the formation of religiously based political identities after the British begin to introduce a program of constitutional reforms from 1909 onwards. Okay. Now, in terms of making links between these four concepts, okay, you might be able to, for now, we'll just make simple links, okay? The simple links that we can make is between imperialism and nationalism, okay? British imperialism in India, okay, from 1857 onwards, okay, in light of in light of the sort of 100-year period that we're concerned with, that directly leads to the nationalist movement being created, okay, the nationalist movement being formed, which seeks to gain more self-governing measures, okay, which seeks to pave the way for Indian independence as a result of the fact that India is being economically exploited by the British, and also as a result of the fact that the British are seeking to modernize and westernize India through their cultural imperialism, and the Indian nationalists don't really see this as appropriate. Okay. Another link can also be made directly between democratization and communalism. Okay. As a result of the constitutional reform program introduced by the British from 1909 onwards, primarily, okay, that forces Indians to mobilize according to their religion, because of the fact that the British introduce separate sort of electorates which require the Indians to basically form political parties along religious lines, okay? And that is one of the sort of problems with Indian society, the fact that religion really, really sort of interferes in the sort of political realm, okay? They cannot really be separated. So despite the fact that many Congress leaders and Gandhi argued that India is a secular nation, which means that religion and politics is completely divided, okay? That is hardly ever the case, because religion and politics in India can never really be separated. Right, moving on.